Senator, the Honourable Desmond McKenzie. That's a live broadcast of Cliff News Online, Tuesday, June 17, 2025, from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m, live from the Jamaica Conference Centre, Port Royal Street, downtown Kingston. Only on Nationwide 90 FM, the new revolution in media. This broadcast is brought to you by the Ministry of Local Government and Community Development.
The mission of the Ministry of Legal and Constitutional Affairs includes revising Jamaica's legal and constitutional infrastructure and accelerating the pace of reform. The time by the MLCA is
1 o'clock.
The people's champion. Our mission is love. Our vision is love. Jamaicans for justice. The people's champion. Justice, justice for all. Justice under the law. Justice, Jamaica demand. Right to life, right to liberty. Justice, justice for all. Justice under the law. Justice, the people demand. Right to life and security. Oh, what a joy. Oh, what a peace. How great this country could be.
It's Tuesday at 1 p.m. and well, it's Monday at 1 p.m. and you're listening to Nationwide 90 FM, and that means you're also listening to Let's Talk Justice. My name is Jade Williams. I'm the Policy Research and Advocacy Manager at Jamaicans for Justice. Thank you so much for joining us, those on our YouTube, those on Radioland, those on JFJ's YouTube. We appreciate the support each week. This week, I'm alone again. We are still missing my co-host, Miss Mikkel Jackson. Hopefully she will be back in the next 2 to 3 weeks or so. But I'll be keeping on holding down the fort until she joins us, right? So this week we're covering the topic, the need for anti-discrimination legislation. And we said legislation in the topic, but it's really the need for anti-discrimination protections. And we're going to talk about what exists. We're going to talk about where the gaps are. And then we are going to speak to what can be done to bridge some of those gaps. So we'll be joined by Executive Director of Equality for All Foundation, Glenroy Murray. But before we get there, we have, or did you know, and our trivia question for the week. So we'll start with the did you know, which comes from section 13.3L of the of the Constitution, which states that all Jamaicans have the right to freedom from discrimination on the grounds of being male or female, race, place of origin, social class, color, religion, or political opinion. So these are the categories by which freedom from discrimination is protected in Jamaica. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means, what the fact that this is a closed list means, and how that affects those who were not listed, if you have characteristics that were not listed in that list, right? We also have today our trivia question, which is, in what year was Jamaica's most recent Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms passed? So the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms is that part in the Constitution where we have the list of all the rights and freedoms that you have as a Jamaican, as by virtue of being born as a Jamaican. And so we're asking you to tell us when this was last amended, when the last amendment was passed, right? So you can respond by sending a WhatsApp to 2397583. You can send a message on Nationwide's YouTube channel, on JFJ's YouTube channel, or on our Instagram at JA4Justice. Right. So today's episode, as we said, is on anti-discrimination legislation. A little bit later on in the show, we're going to be talking about some other rights that we have by virtue of international law that may not necessarily be showing up in our constitution and in our legislative framework. And some of these are things that we would have, highlighted in our submission to the Constitutional Reform Committee on some of these challenges, right? But while our constitution, as we just heard, offers some anti-discrimination protections, such as those related to race and place of origin and political opinions. It does not provide broad enforceable safeguards against discrimination based on factors like gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, health status, for one. So if you're a person living with HIV, protection from discrimination is not necessarily outlined in our constitution for you. Now, these gaps would have left Jamaicans vulnerable to unfair treatment in employment, education, healthcare, and in other aspects of public life without clear avenues for redress. Now, several groups, including JFJ, would have repeatedly called for some more robust legislation. As I said earlier, we'll be joined by Executive Director from Equality for All Foundation, Glenroy Murray, who would be familiar with some of those conversations that we've been having around the need for anti-discrimination legislation. In 2023, the conversation was reignited when there was a proposal for a hate speech bill. And there was discussion from these civil society groups, including JFJ, about having an anti-discrimination law, which may be a bit more robust than what was being proposed at the time. We did see, of course, recent statistics coming from, for example, the Jamaica Network of Seropositives, showing that persons with HIV, for example, continue to experience stigma and discrimination as a result of their HIV status. We would have also recently been reviewed, that's Jamaica Now, by the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. That's the third committee at the UN. And we would have been given recommendations to adopt targeted legislation to cover things like colorism and discrimination against Rastafarians, right? So we have seen, while we have made strides, we have seen that there remains gaps in our discrimination protection. So we are currently joined by Executive Director of Equality for All Foundation, Glenroy Murray. Glenroy, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Are you hearing me?
Yes, I'm hearing you. Thank you so much for joining us. I think I would first ask, I pointed out some of them, legislative, what the gaps are. We don't see protection from discrimination for certain groups in the Constitution. What are these key issues when it comes to protection from discrimination?
So some of the biggest issues, as you've pointed out, is the fact that not every group is covered. So you don't necessarily see discrimination on the basis of age. You don't see discrimination on the basis of health status. You don't see discrimination on the basis of marital status, and you also don't see it on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And then the other part of that is that our Constitution covers different types of discrimination in different settings, but when it comes on to private services, it's not comprehensive. And so you're looking at, when you're trying to get a job, you're looking at if you're going to private healthcare or private education, those anti-discrimination rules aren't evenly applied. And so those are some of the challenges.
So just to clarify for the listeners, is it that a private institution does not have to abide by the same rules that a public institution does?
To say it differently is that there are specific rules in our Constitution, if that's what we're focusing on, based on what's currently present, that guarantees equitable and humane treatment by a public authority. So the courts still are trying to figure out what that means. But the essence of that is that in one of their judgments, they've essentially said that it means that people shouldn't be discriminated in accessing public services. But if those services are being carried out by private actors, then that section does not apply to them. You go to the section 33I in our Constitution that most of us focus on, and that is not as comprehensive because it doesn't cover every category in the ways that the broader provision in the other section 13.3H covers them. And so in a context where a lot of the services are offered privately, it means that there are gaps in our constitutional framework, and therefore people can get away with certain types of discrimination.
Thank you for that context. So, what have we have had the charter, and that would have been a fairly recent, maybe a little over a decade now, that we would have made that amendment. What have we done in order to improve this situation where it comes to persons experiencing discrimination here? Or is it that we have made no further steps since the charter?
And that we is Jamaica or
Jamaica.
civil society?
Jamaica.
Okay, I mean, so there have been policy efforts. So since the charter, we have the policy on diversity by the Jamaica Constabulary Force. There, the National Youth Policy very broadly promotes principle of anti-discrimination in the Charter of Rights that in health facilities, they have some of those principles baked into it. So there's a sense, to a certain degree, varying across the different public institutions, that people ought not to be discriminated against. But in terms of making it comprehensive, for example, the Disabilities Act does a lot of good things. It talks about the duty on everyone, not just the government, on everyone to work towards making their services accessible. Right. So those are the kinds of positive steps that have been made, but it's not comprehensive. So it doesn't apply to everybody. It doesn't apply to all groups. And that's where the challenge is. It's almost like I say, a little effort being made over here and over there, but not right around the board.
All right. So in the interim that we have, seen some of these strides, what has civil society done to kind of push it?
So I think it's twofold. So the first part is educating our communities about what their rights are and what their opportunities are. So a lot of people don't know about existing opportunities. So, for example, in employment, if you're unfairly dismissed, you might have a case before the Industrial Disputes Tribunal, right? And people have used those kind of avenues. So civil society has done a lot of legal literacy sessions with communities to get them to understand what their opportunities are. But then there's a bigger effort to develop a model anti-discrimination legislation so that so that there's a framework that the government can adopt. And there's been a lot of advocacy to try and get them to adopt it. It's kind of waned a little bit because of the kind of stated disinterest in taking on the model legislation, but it does provide a framework or an ideal that we can continue to push the government around in terms of making the anti-discrimination provisions that we do have a bit more comprehensive.
So what are some of the things that are in the model legislation or would have been proposed for model legislation?
So a couple of the things that were proposed. So the first thing is that the model legislation seeks to have a broader category of people protected from all forms of discrimination. And then they go beyond that to actually looking at different sectors, making sure that, similar to legislation elsewhere, that if you're in a certain sector, that you understand what equality looks like and the kind of provisions that you need to have in place. So if I were to use an example, in existing legislation, we have anti-sexual harassment legislation in Jamaica. And a part of that is it creates an obligation on companies to have anti-sexual harassment policies. So the model anti-discrimination legislation uses a similar approach to promote anti-discrimination among different bodies. And so if they were to adopt that kind of legislation, then you would see people developing more, and some of them do exist in different companies, more diversity-related policies aimed things are equal. And it also seeks to establish a tribunal and a commission that would take on these matters in case you are discriminated against. It's like a specialized body that would hear discrimination matters so that it doesn't clog up the court systems. Once again, similar to the anti-sexual harassment tribunal.
And I think also similar to it's a similar model to what we do with the ATI, where we have a tribunal that just adjudicates those specific issues. So I don't think it's something that's too far outside of the realm of what we've seen legislatively done in Jamaica already. Okay, so we're coming up on the break. I'm going to ask you to stay with us. When we come back from the break, I just want you to share with us if there are any other countries that have implemented anti-discrimination legislation that we could look towards, how that has been implemented, and any other steps that have been taken in the Caribbean towards improving discrimination protections for all groups. So we'll take the break, and when we come back.
Yeah, no problem.
All right.
The following hurricane tip is brought to you by PowerTech Jamaica. Reinforce windows with plywood or storm shutters. Clean gutters, check your roof, and tie down loose outdoor items. A single flying object can cause major damage. When the power fails, don't be left in the dark. PowerTech supplies Jamaica with reliable UPS systems and backup generators, perfect for homes and businesses. The preceding hurricane tip was brought to you by PowerTech Jamaica. Telephone 876-908-0196-9.
Tune in to Cliff Views Online from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. as we broadcast live from the MSME Business Roadshow in Westmoreland, Wednesday, June 18 at Manning School. Take your business to another level and get ready to start, innovate, export, and grow. Join Jamaica's business ministry and gain access to government incentives, financing opportunities, and vital MSME support to fuel your growth. You'll even have the chance to win up to $400,000 in business cash grants. So bring your ideas, your ambition, and your drive. So tune in to Cliff Views Online June 18 from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. It's the MSME Business Roadshow in Westmoreland. Catch the live stream on our YouTube channel at Nationwide 90 FM Live 2. All this and more only on Nationwide 90 FM, the new revolution in media. This broadcast is brought to you by the Ministry of Industry, Investment and Commerce and the Inter-American Development Bank. Register now at roadshow.miic.gov.jm.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We've been discussing anti-discrimination protections here in Jamaica, and we're joined by Glenroy Murray, who is the Executive Director of Equality for All Foundation. So before the break, Glenroy, I was just asking you to give us an idea of, other countries that have implemented anti-discrimination legislation that we could maybe look to for inspiration, and also, what strides have been taken in the Caribbean, in the region generally, towards better anti-discrimination protections.
So there are a few countries across the world that have taken different approaches to this road. I guess fortunately and unfortunately, a lot of those countries are, more Western countries. So the Equalities Act in the UK is a prime example of that. Mm-hmm. There's different legislation in Australia. Of course, there's legislation in Canada. All that have used different models of anti-discrimination protection that are useful and that we can learn from. Some using some of the similar approaches that we are proposing in the model legislation. Outside of that, in the Caribbean, there have been efforts. So, for example, in CARICOM, there is model anti-discrimination legislation that CARICOM developed for use by other countries in the region. Of course, there are limits to that. It was a very early model, and so it's not as comprehensive as the model that we're using or pushing here in Jamaica. But there are versions of that. For example, there is the equal opportunities legislation in Trinidad. There's also currently ongoing efforts in Belize to develop or legislate, equalities legislation.
Okay. Okay. So is it that, for example, in Trinidad, how new is their framework? Is it new, or is it something that they've had a chance to implement fulsomely?
So it's been around for quite some time. I would say over 10 years. It was under review a couple of years ago because it has gaps. So, for example, it doesn't prohibit sexual orientation discrimination, for example. So it covers some grounds. It does have a commission and a tribunal, but it is limited in some facts. We're under review to improve it. It borrows from that CARICOM model.
I'm sorry, I seem to have lost Glenroy there. But we're gonna try to get him back. We were just discussing the legislative framework that is in Trinidad. I believe Glenroy was saying that it is based on the same CARICOM model legislation that was developed, and that it remains with some of those gaps that CARICOM model legislation would have had. We got him? Right. So, essentially, we would want to see an expansion from simple protection from discrimination that does not extend to certain categories of persons. So I believe that Trinidad and Tobago legislation would be instructive for us to understand how they would have adapted the CARICOM model legislation. All right, so we're going to take a quick break while we work out this technical issue, and we'll be right back.
Join Cliff Hughes online on Tuesday, June 17, 2025 from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. live from the Jamaica Conference Center, Port Royal Street, downtown Kingston. The employment of over 10,000 youth in a bid to enhance the services offered by the local government sector will be the prime focus of the Ministry of Local Government and Community Development's Youth Summer Employment Program, YSEP. Hear highlights on the benefits, purpose, and structure of YSEP from special guest speaker, Prime Minister Dr. the Most Honorable Andrew Holness, and Portfolio Minister the Honorable Desmond McKenzie. That's a live broadcast of Cliff Hughes Online, Tuesday, June 17, 2025 from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. live from the Jamaica Conference Center, Port Royal Street, downtown Kingston. Only on Nationwide 90 FM, the new revolution in media. This broadcast is brought to you by the Ministry of Local Government and Community Development.
All right, welcome back to Let's Start Justice. We have been discussing anti-discrimination protections, and we are joined by Glenroy Murray, Executive Director, Equality for All Foundation. Glenroy, before we lost you, I think you were giving us some of the scope of that Trinidad and Tobago legislation there.
Oh, yeah, sorry about that. I'm not sure where exactly you lost me.
Where you were saying that it is similarly modeled to the CARICOM legislation?
Yeah, okay, understood. So yeah, I was saying because it's similarly modeled to CARICOM, there are certain built-in limitations because of that, including the categories that it does not cover. So that's why they were seeking to review it in Trinidad a couple of years back so that it can be a bit more comprehensive, covering more groups of people. And I was just saying, I think a reason why the model, they even at least established some model for anti-discrimination in Trinidad, I would guess is because of the kind of racial diversity that exists there. And so there would be an understanding of a greater need for that versus contexts like Jamaica, where there, our population is significantly a majority Black population, then perceptions of difference and discrimination are not as pronounced.
Yeah, thank you for that, Gunray. So, I mean, all right, so we know that there are gaps, and we know that we are working on the gaps in terms of policy changes, in terms of the public education that we can do from the civil society side. So just to make clear to our listeners, what exactly exists in terms of redress options? So if you're a person living with HIV and you are denied healthcare, for example, or if you are fired from your job, and you think it's based on your gender identity or sexual orientation, is there something you can do now, despite the gaps, to address it?
Well, the short answer to that is very possibly. And so every case, as you would know, Jay, turns on the facts of it. But given the current legal framework that we have in Jamaica, if you are fired for discriminatory reasons, you might have a case before the Industrial Disputes Tribunal. And I know that JFJ does take those kinds of matters to represent people in those kinds of circumstances. If you are denied access to healthcare and it's a public health facility, there are internal systems within the within the public health sector where you can make a report. They actually have a new unit within the Ministry of Health that deals with those kinds of matters that around their client complaint mechanism, where you can get redressed. There also is the Jamaica Network of Seropositive. If it's a HIV-related matter, you can go to them and report the case, and they work with government agencies to get you redressed. So that is an option to you as well. But if it is public health services, then it may fall under the current constitutional framework. And if it rises to that level, or if the person is interested in constitutional relief, then that's an option that is available to them. When it's private healthcare, it might be a little bit different. So that is a solid, it depends.
Yeah.
But there are piecemeal opportunities depending on if it's disabilities, then of course you have a whole legal framework around that now.
And are you aware of any matters that would have been related to discrimination that would have been maybe taken to the constitutional level?
Actually, it didn't necessarily end positively for the complainant. It's this case. It was somebody who applied for a job as a teacher, and I think it was Monique. That was the institution that they were suing. I might have that. I think it was Monique, but I could be incorrect on that. But the point of it was the person who did have a disability was not hired, and they felt that it was on the basis of discrimination. And of course, this was before the disabilities legislation came into force. So they did bring a claim before the High Court under a violation of Section 13(3)(h), on the basis that the institution was a public authority and therefore was bound to not discriminate. The case didn't necessarily end in that person's favor, primarily because it was felt that one, they had to prove a lot of things, including that the institution was in fact a public authority, and that they had to, the level of what they needed to show that it was discrimination was, in my view, a very high standard. And so in the end, they're like, well, this school has shown other reasons why they didn't hire you, and it wasn't because of discrimination. So the fact that there is anti-discrimination provisions by themselves doesn't necessarily mean that all cases will be successful, right? And that's an important thing to understand, that in a lot of jurisdictions across the world, anti-discrimination cases are some of the hardest to prove because of the ways in which discrimination shows up. And that's why if you have a commission set up that promotes standards for equality, it works out better for the ordinary people, because then it's more preventative than responsive to incidences of discrimination.
Yeah, I have to agree with you there, because one of the challenges that I have with the pace of justice, is that you feel as though you have a legitimate claim, but it's such a high threshold when you are taking it before the Constitutional Court. Whereas if it was a matter that you can look at the legislation and be able to understand exactly what this is, and what was done, then it would be easily adjudicated. So I have to agree with you there. And I think it does make it a lot less accessible for persons who have had their rights breached to seek redress when the only option may be to go to the Constitutional Court.
Yeah, and just to add, I think a part of it is also how discrimination often happens. Sometimes it's not explicit, it's not the exact words that they said. One, you need proof that they said the words that you're claiming to go before any type of court. And so that alone might be difficult, because if it's an offhand comment that they made in an interview, for example, you might not be able to prove that they made that comment.
Right.
And a lot of time when discrimination happens, it's not so explicit that you can immediately pick up that that's what happened. You really sometimes have to sit and reflect and hear someone else's experience and realize, oh, I'm being treated differently. So the level of evidence collection to show differential treatment, which is sometimes a legal standard that is used, is very difficult, because then you're going to have to find somebody who's willing to speak on your behalf to say, I am not like you and I was treated differently and it's unfair because of these reasons. And because of that, it's more challenging, which is why I think it's critical that we have a body that says to companies, to government agencies, to everyone, that this is the standard that you need to meet when you're operating. And if you fail to meet these standards, that itself is a violation, which is what happens within the sexual harassment legislative framework that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I think that is a pretty comprehensive response, and I appreciate the conversation that we've had. Thank you for joining us, Glenroy.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so that was Glenroy Murray, the Executive Director of Equality for All Foundation, and we were discussing the need for anti-discrimination protections in Jamaica. And as we were having that discussion, I was reminded of a part of Everton Douglas's case where he brought the issue of how he was being treated in lockup, and he brought it on the grounds of, equitable and humane treatment by a public authority, and the court did not agree that he was not treated equitably and humanely. He also brought on the basis of torture and inhumane treatment, and when the court looked at it, the court would have said, well, everybody else in the lockup is treated the same way as you. And so it can't be unequitable or inhumane if it's the same treatment that everyone else receives, even though the treatment within itself would have been negative. That was not what the test was. So even when you look at that, right and what you consider it to be, it might not be exactly lined up with what your consideration was. But I did promise you all that we would continue to speak to, different rights that we have signed on to have, for example, in our international obligations, that we don't have here, or we don't have fulsomely here in Jamaica. And I think when we talk about rights, I think we should always remember where we're coming from when it comes to human rights, that at one point we had none. And that point is not that far back, right? We're looking at just 1944 is when we would have achieved universal adult suffrage here in Jamaica. So it's not that far back, right? But we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll get into that discussion.
At the Jamaica Customs Agency, we care for our employees, customers, stakeholders, citizens, and our country. Customs cares. The temperature by the Jamaica Customs Agency is
25 degrees Celsius in Kingston, 31 degrees Celsius in Montego Bay.
Excerpt from Minister Desmond McKenzie's sectoral presentation.
The flagship of this administration is the Youth Summer Employment Program. This is the largest youth employment program in the English-speaking Caribbean. Last year, we improved the program to 10,000. This year, Madam Speaker, we will remain the same. But you know, the economy is good. Yes. So the minimum wage has been increased. And so we are moving the weekly salary to 17,000 a week for 4 weeks.
Excerpt from Minister Desmond McKenzie's sectoral presentation, brought to you by the Ministry of Local Government and Community Development.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. So we were discussing anti-discrimination protections here, and that here in Jamaica. So that would be leading us now into a discussion generally about the rights or the rights that we don't have in our constitution. And one of the first ones I wanted to talk about was the right to health or to health care. What we have a right to a healthy and productive environment. And if you were here, I think it was last week, we would have been joined by Teresa Rodriguez Moody from JET, who was discussing what the right to a healthy and productive environment means. And I think if you were reading the Gleaner this Sunday, you would have seen an editorial from her and Diana Macaulay about the same right. But that essentially speaks to your environment where you live, right? The space around you. But when we speak to a right to health outside of that, it is a right to health care. It is a right to receiving a high standard or good quality of health care. It is something that we are obligated to have as a part of the rights available to us as Jamaicans, because we signed on to international instruments that give us that obligation. That would be the International Covenant of Social and Cultural Rights, right? So that would include that right to health. But the right to health is talking about standard of health. It is talking about the presence of healthcare facilities. It is talking about the presence of experts in healthcare. It is talking about resources, all of those things that make, and also access, the time in which you are able to receive necessary healthcare. And of course, one of the challenges with, putting things in your constitution is that they become serious obligations now, right? That you must put legislation in, that you must put budgets behind. And so that can be a deterrent to extending the level of rights protections that we might receive. But health is one of them. Another one that we would have looked at extensively was the right to education. Currently, the way we have a right to a child being treated as a child by virtue of them being a child. And we also have attached to that a right to education at the pre-primary and primary levels. So that means that the right is guaranteed, pre-primary and primary levels, but once you get to the high school level, secondary, tertiary level, the right is no longer guaranteed, right? So that means that there can be barriers that affect your right to an education that you may not have constitutional action against, right? Now, we would have made the recommendation, we being JFJ, to have seen this right extended to at least the tertiary level. And this would also follow the legislative reasoning of the Ministry of Justice so far, where we would have seen that, for example, the maintenance of a child extends up until that child has finished their tertiary education, right? So we believe that it would improve or protection of rights if that right was to be extended, especially as we look at now some of the challenges that we're having with, childhood education and teenagers being truants in school. I know we had an episode recently as well with Richard Troop from the Ministry of Education speaking to how they're trying to address those issues of truancy and policies that are coming in place later. But one of those things, I think, would be ensuring that the right to education is enshrined in the Constitution up to its tertiary level. Now, we also spoke to the right to protection from discrimination. And as Glenroy was speaking, he listed out a few categories. So what is in our constitution is what I showed you earlier for, or did you know, which is section 13.3i that has a list, right? So if you look at the list, you'll see male or female, so you don't see gender identity. And some people might think, oh, this is related to, people who are a part of the LGBT community. But there are also persons who are biologically not male or female. Those are intersex persons, and they would not be protected under the Constitution. We would also not see, for example, a protection from discrimination on the basis of health status. So if you're a person living with HIV, that's not a constitutional protection. We have seen some, as Glenroy pointed out, we have seen some attempts to bridge those gaps. But I think one of the things we have to highlight is the difference between policy and legislation. When we look at policy, we are looking at a guide, right? And especially if it is something that is a public policy, so it is asking institutions to accept it, but not compelling them to accept it, right? And the difference between that and legislation is that legislation will have consequences. And we would have seen this with our Sexual Harassment Act. So I know that in the private sector, for sure, there have been sexual harassment policies that have existed long before our Sexual Harassment Act would have been put in place. However, the Sexual Harassment Act now would compel not just those who feel like it is a good thing to have a policy to have one, but to compel those who would otherwise not have a policy to have one, right? It would also compel them where they don't have a policy to have consequences for that, right? So there are fines, there is prison time, depending on what breaches of the legislation were made. But essentially, this provides a much more robust framework than simply a directive to each agency, private sector company to create a policy of their own. And this also provides greater protection to employees, outside of the public sector, who are able to, even where their private company does not have a policy, go to the state to say, the policy doesn't exist, this has been happening, and I need redress, right? So it's a similar framework that we heard Glenroy speaking to when we spoke to the anti-discrimination legislation. I think one of the things that JFJ has pushed is the need for a national human rights institution. And as Glenroy was speaking about, a body that could look at, a commission that could look at these issues, that was one of the things that came to my mind, a national human rights institution that would not only look at non-discrimination issues, but look at all issues related to human rights breaches and be able to make those kinds of decisions, not clogging up the court system, as we said, because of course, once you put in robust legislation that responds to breaches in rights, people will have more claims, right? So there will be a number of complaints that will come out of that, and there will need to be some good administrative management. But I think, as we have said publicly and through our submissions to the Constitutional Reform Committee, that a national human rights institution is an absolute imperative, especially in a rights landscape as we have here in Jamaica, and particularly in the kind of rights framework that we have. Because I think another thing that may be overlooked is that, and as Glenroy said succinctly, our rights, having them in the Constitution does not do everything that you think it does, right? They are listed in the Constitution, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are easily enforceable, or that they are enforceable in the way that you think. And I'm going to give an example. So we have, for example, that right to education at the pre-primary and primary levels. That is a right that we have protected. We have put in our Education Act and its regulations. We have put in supporting policies. We have a Ministry of Education that oversees the directive for education. So we've ensured that there are not only agencies, systems, legislation, policies, everything in place to help to ensure and protect that right. And that's the same for quite a few rights, right? Like your right to life. That's why we would have our Offenses Against the Person Act, or why we would have our Sexual Offences Act to protect your right to life. We spoke to on this episode the right to protection from discrimination. And if we can think in our minds where that right might show up in legislation, we might find ourselves in some difficulty, right? So, for example, we have protection from discrimination in our Disabilities Act, but that's it. There is no generalized protection from discrimination legislation, right? But also, disability is not even a basis in which it's not a listed category, right? So there are some challenges when it comes to the way that we have been able to implement and protect our rights as they are in the Constitution. As we speak to implementation, we have to look at, and I'm going to give an example, we'll come back from the break. The matter of the Kensington primary case is something that we've covered on the show before, but I think it's a good example to show how rights are enforced. So we'll take the break.
It's Monday, get over your blues. Or Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. The E-Zone is here for you. With the Stinger Honey Bee
and Karim Boyatings
from 3 to 5 p.m. on Nationwide 90 FM.
We've got your entertainment news.
Then we want to hear your views. Why you said?
Jump in the mix.
Or the hot seat.
Don't miss our brain busters.
Or the crazy giveaways.
Let's talk fashion.
Send us your outfit of the day. Ooh, cutesy. Very demure.
Are you looking for love?
Come on one of our blind dates. Send your request to ezone blinddates@gmail.com. That's ezoneblindates@gmail.com.
And stay tuned for your confessions.
These are my confessions.
Share them with us at ezoneconfessions@yahoo.com. I mean, is this planet Earth?
Is it?
I don't know. Let me check. Either way, it's got a buzz.
And a bugger thing.
Ow! Ow!
Tune in to Nationwide 90 FM on Tuesday, June 17 from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. for the live sectoral presentation by the Minister of Tourism, the Honorable Edmund Bartlett. Also, you can view the presentation on our YouTube channel at Nationwide 90 FM Live 2. So tune in to Nationwide 90 FM on Tuesday, June 17 from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. It's the live sectoral presentation by the Minister of Tourism, the Honorable Edmund Bartlett. All this and more only on Nationwide 90 FM, the new revolution in media. This broadcast is sponsored by the Ministry of Tourism.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We've been discussing anti-discrimination. We've been discussing the rights in our constitution, the rights not in our constitution. So for this final part of the discussion, I just wanted to highlight how it is that our rights are usually enforced here in Jamaica. And I wanted to use that Kensington primary school case to highlight it, right? I think what's important is to note firstly that this matter went to the Court of Appeal, right? So we would have gotten a judgment before. And in the initial judgment, the court would have indicated that there was no breach of rights. So it went to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal looked at it and summarized and concluded that there would have been a breach of several of the rights of the student involved. So the facts of the case were that the student was admitted to the Kensington Primary School, admitted to the school. She attended their summer school program where she had locks at the time, and it didn't appear to be an issue. When she started school, now she was being told that the locks had to be removed. Now, as I said in the initial matter, the court would have held that there was no breach. But in the Court of Appeal's judgment, the Court of Appeal disagreed with the lower court and would have held that it was unconstitutional for the child to have been prevented from wearing her locked hairstyle. Now, if this was a religious claim, that would be clear that it would be unconstitutional, right? But they did not make the claim on the basis of religion, which we have a right to freedom of religion. They made the claim on the basis to freedom of expression, right? And the court upheld that it was to the child's expression, to their identity, their cultural identity, that their locked hairstyle was a part of that. And therefore, the offending party, being the school, had not shown any reasonable, demonstrably justifiable reason to limit that right, right? But I think what's important about this case is that in the prior matters that we would have seen that dealt with freedom of expression or dealt with the equitable and humane treatment of a public authority in the exercise of any function, for example, we would not have understood the rights to mean what they ended up meaning in this at the end of this matter. So, for example, freedom of expression would have previously have been thought to cover speech and not extend beyond speech. And this interpretation of the right would have changed how we look at it. So now we know that it goes to things that go to your cultural identity, right? And if it goes to that, that could be in any number of things outside of speech, making the right differently enforceable than it was before. Similarly, we spoke to the same matter in the Everton Douglas case with the equitable and humane treatment before a public authority. And we were able to greater understand now that this is a right that's seen on a comparative level, where if you have all persons of this category being treated the same, then it is usually likely equitable. So the next step would be whether it is humane treatment in the exercise of their function in a public authority, right? And we would have seen where the court held that that was not the case. Now, the school would have brought as their response to the claim that the hygiene of the child was an issue, and that would have been reason enough to limit the child's right. Or it wasn't even this specific child, but it was generally that the hygiene of locked hairstyles could cause issues at the school. Seemingly, to my mind, a discriminatory statement, but the court had to regard it, and having regarded it, disregarded it, right? Because at the end of the day, they could not prove that this was a matter that affected this child, or even that it generally affected locked hairstyles, or any of those assertions that had been made originally. So it was interesting to see, having in the first instance been rejected, to see these rights now upheld. Now, when we were talking about access, one of the challenges with something like this is that when you bring a constitutional claim, it's expensive. You have to pay your attorney, and in the first instance, this claim lost. And in cases where you lose, there are usually costs associated with the matter, and so you would have to repay the person to whom you brought to court for their legal fees and any other expenses that they would have incurred coming to court to answer this claim. You know, so seeing that it is a constitutional claim, it can be frustrating to bring a constitutional claim to lose and then be at a loss, especially if you thought that your rights were breached in the first instance. So this goes back again to our call for that national human rights institution that would be able to adjudicate these things at a much lesser rate than the constitutional court may have to. I think what we also, and I brought it up in the interview, but another challenge is the pace of justice, because this appeal would have been finalized and the judgment given in 2024. I think it was in July or June of 2024. The original matter that brought these people to court in the first place was filed in 2020. And the original, filed before 2020 in 2018, and the original judgment came down in 2020. So that would have been years of adjudicating this matter. And while we can appreciate, and as citizens, we should appreciate, those of us who are willing to go that extra mile, because it now means that other students with locked hairstyles will not have to go through the trouble of doing a constitutional claim because the precedent exists. But it would have been extremely difficult for these persons to be able to access justice. I know that at some point JFJ would have assisted with the matter, of course, to no expense to the family, but not in every case that involves the breach of rights would JFJ be able to assist. So it is really a challenge of access and something that we need to look at fulsomely. All right, so we do have a winner for our trivia question for today. Our trivia question for today was our Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms. When was it passed? Or when was it amended and passed? And the answer came from Rick NYCJM. The answer is 2011. So it was amended and passed in 2011. Rick, I'm going to ask you to send a WhatsApp to 2397583 so we can respond with your prize. But the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms is Chapter 3 of our Constitution. We should all know that by now if you're listeners of Let's Talk Justice, because we reference it constantly and consistently, right? But Chapter 3 of your Constitution lists all of the rights that exist. And as we're going through that exist here in Jamaica that are enforceable. And as we are going through a constitutional reform process, this charter actually came out of the last constitutional reform process that we had. So in that 1999 process, we would have seen the recommendation for an expansion of the rights that were in the charter, and that were in Chapter 3, and that resulted in our 2011 charter. Now, the rights that I spoke to you earlier that are not in there, for example, the expansion of discrimination to include health status, to include sexual orientation, the expansion of the right to education to go up to tertiary levels, the expansion to see a right to health generally and not just a right to a healthy environment. Those were also things that were recommended in that 1999 constitutional reform process. So when we had originally seen the 2011 charter, it was thought that those items would have made their way to it. So it was unfortunate that they didn't. So now that we are here again, looking at constitutional reform, we have to continue to push that recommendation that once we get to that phase 2 section and we're looking at the Charter of Fundamental Rights, that the expansion of those rights is at the forefront of our legislators' minds, so that we can see how we improve how persons not only access their rights, but the rights that are available to them. And to those of us who are still listening right now, to remind you that where your rights are breached, Jamaicans for Justice is there to help. If it is not Jamaicans for Justice that can assist you, we will see how best one of our partners can assist you. But it is important as Jamaicans that we do not ignore those instances when our rights are breached, because when it is that we try to enforce it, it will no longer be seen as something important if you constantly ignore the breaches in the past, right? So we have to ensure that we put ourselves in a position to enforce our rights here in Jamaica. I wanted to answer this one last question I saw in the chat asking, what is justice and where did that word come from? That word is older than me and you, and probably older than Jamaica as a country, but that word comes from the Latin, so long before we ever existed, justus, and it just means that you are able to exercise authority by assigning reward or punishment, right? Generally speaking. But as we evolved and grew, we associated the word justice to mean fairness and equity. So in exercising that authority, there must be fairness and equity, right? And that's what we will continue to push for as Jamaicans for Justice. So thank you all for joining us for the show today. My name is Jade Williams, Policy Research and Advocacy Manager at Jamaicans for Justice, and we'll be back next week. This was Let's Start Justice. And thank you to the European Union for sponsoring the show.
Jamaicans, by justice, the people's champion. Justice, justice for all. Justice under the law. Justice, Jamaica demand. Right to life, right to liberty. Out of many we are one in a Jamaica. Make it a better place for the boys and girls. Created equal by the creator. For equal rights and opportunities. No to unlawful detention and police brutalization. Class, gender, race or religion. We not tolerate discrimination.
To join the fight against injustice, contact us at 755-4524 or JamaicансForJustice.org.
The people's champion.
Excerpt from Minister Desmond Mackenzie's sectoral presentation,